Okay, so this is a job, brick house. We have to re-render it completely in Silicone Render. So first thing we have to do is hack off the plinths. They were not suitable, they were all over the place. We basically had to start again. Then we've primed the walls with Baumit Uniprimer, which is a universal primer that you can use on any surface for rendering. We've also stuck the beads, which we'll talk about in future of this video. But first off, let's talk about the application. Now, this is a bagged render. The render I'm using is called KZP. Now, KZP is a product from Baumit. Now, like I said, it's a pre-bagged render that's designed to be applied in 2 coats. So there's going to be 3 stages to this. I'm going to be applying the scratch coat, and then we're going to be running mesh into it. Now, what we're doing now is applying a thin layer. We don't want the scratch coat to be too thick, and the beads end up meeting up to about 12 mil thickness. So we're going to have a base coat of about 12 mil, and there'll be a SilikonTop on top of this. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. So what we've done, we've got one person applying, the other one running the mesh through. Now, we've put a thin coat of render running straight onto the brickwork. Again, we've waited for the primer to dry out, but that's all we've done. Now what we're doing is just bedding that mesh nicely into the render. Now we're not going to go too deep. What we used to do with another product, StarContact, we notch it and then we run the mesh into it. We just didn't think it was suitable for this particular instance. But we're not going to push it all the way in. We want to make sure that mesh sits on the surface almost. So we're just going to gently rub the render through. I don't know what Charlie's showing me there, by the way. I can't remember what he's pointing at. Probably his big thumbs or something, I don't know. But either way, we're going to run the render and make sure it sits slightly through on the mesh, but we're not going to push it all the way. We need to make sure that mesh sits slightly in front of the render, and that way if there is any movement, that base coat underneath can take the impact, and then this can stop any of them cracks coming through to the surface. Again, it's not always been necessary to run mesh into your render, but now, as a rule of thumb, it's the only thing I do. I only run mesh into the render. Okay, we charge a bit more, but as a product, you know it's going to be safer, and you know you're going to have a longer, more stable wall as a result of it. So the process is still the same, just gently running that mesh through. We actually ran another thin layer on top, just to keep that thickness, and then I'm going to run a scratch through. This is a 2-coat system, a 2-part system. Now, because we've used a mesh and we've pushed it to the forefront of that first coat, ideally this is like an OCR render. You want to make sure that both coats are applied when it's wet on wet, or at least wet on green, so you made sure that that sticking point is made together. We're going to talk about KZPs, we're going to talk about the pros, we're going to talk about the cons, but I'm going to potentially walk you through why this is one of the best renderers to use in terms of brick wall, and I'll show you why in a minute. I know a lot of people are very hesitant to move from standard sand cement, and that's absolutely fine. But if I can just show you alternatives, like I try and do in this channel, then at least it can help you on the way. In terms of application, it's a great product. Like I said, it's pre-bagged. You just add water, simple. You don't have to worry about mixes or measurements or bloody half buckets of lime and additives, and don't have to worry about any of that. It's all pre-made. The downfall in this product I've found, unlike some of the other Brad products I've used, is when it comes to ruling. Now, it can pull a little bit. This takes a bit of getting used to. At the beginning it's okay, so this section is absolutely fine. But what I've found is if you leave the render too long, then it kind of develops a skin, and then the render almost tears when you rule it off. So at first it took a bit of getting used to. So again, I've just ruled off the wall as you would do usually. I'm going to fill in any low spots and then rule it back again. So at this point you might find it might tear a little bit. Now this can deter a few people, put a few people off, but don't let it, because I'm going to show you in a minute why this is an amazing product to use. Now what we're doing, we've got Charlie applying ahead of me. We want to make sure that bead to bead runs all the way through. We've got an expansion joint in the middle of this wall. So this wall is roughly around 11 meters long. Anything past 6 meters, you need an expansion joint. So I've got an expansion joint running in the middle, and what I've done is made sure that that channel runs flat all the way through. So Charlie was ahead of me, we ran the channel through, and then we've applied the rest of the render, and then we've ruled it off. So if it does start pulling, by the way, when you're ruling the render, then just apply a mist of water and start again, and trust you, the benefits will be brilliant. Now look at this, we're just using a power flow, nothing new here. and it's floating up. It looks okay, you know, it's not doing a bad job at all. It's floating, happy days. So we've left it about 2 hours. This product does dry quite fast, but I'm going to show you in a minute why it's so versatile. Now look, it looks okay. It's not too bad. Now look what happens. Don't treat this like sand cement. Apply a small mist of water onto it, just a little layer, and now watch what happens as soon as you do that. When you apply that water, the way it floats up, especially with a power float, is just absolutely amazing. Now this is what makes this product quite magical. As soon as you add that tiny mist of water on top of that product, it just floats up like a dream. And I swear down, we probably wouldn't even need to sponge it. The way it floats is just quite magical. All the spots start filling in. The product moves along with itself. It doesn't pull. It doesn't want to pull itself away like sometimes OCR does. Or OCR I can find can get quite bubbly sometimes. Because this is a two-coat system designed to be applied on top of each other. You apply a little mist of water, it doesn't pull away from the scratch, but look at the way that floats up. It's effortless, and you've got an immediate flat wall after about 2 minutes work. So this is how to use KZP. Just use a bit of water. If it's pulling when you're ruling it, spray a little bit of water on it. Definitely spray a bit of water before you start to power float it, because the difference is absolutely amazing. And this is the best product we've used for floating. Like I said, the downside can be when it comes to the ruling. I'm not going to lie to you all, this is a channel I'm trying to be as honest as I possibly can be, so I'm always going to tell you the flaws in the product. I'm not just going to sit here and say it's all hunky-dory. But when it comes to the floating, you do get flatter walls, you get stronger walls as well. When you do the tap test after it, it doesn't feel like anything's hollow, it feels like it's an absolutely solid slab of render. So in terms of strength, the finish and flatness, that's what makes this bagged render, for me, one of the best on the market. And I'm using this a lot more over OCR. I'll use OCR if we've got a small area, that's great. But the other thing is this stuff's very sticky. We were sticking all our beads, so we're just applying a little level bit. We're just sticking the beads directly onto the render. Again, it's all pre-mixed, just add water, but the beads will just stick directly onto it, and you don't have to worry about any fixings, or we might have a few fixings. It looks a bit unstable after it, but we've never had to worry about that in the past. So what we're doing is running that bead. We've got to run the stop bead all along where the old DPC line is. So where the old plinth was hacked back, we're going to run a stop bead through, and then we're going to render to it. But let's talk more about the beads and how to fix them. Now the first thing we're doing is going to fit the beads. Now the walls have been pre-gritted. I'm actually unsure about this area. It looks a bit flaky, so I'm actually going to assess this. But first I'm just going to fit the beads anyway. I think I'm actually going to scabble this back, which is basically just a massive grinder to get rid of all that paint. Because to be fair, just because it's pre-gritted, it doesn't mean that the surface below is any good. Look, I'm kind of peeling the paint off. I didn't actually do this, my labourer did, but I'm thinking, I don't like that, to be fair. I think I'm going to get a scabble on it and actually just rip it back, just back to there. It's probably a good base. The bottom looks good, which is why I'm going to be fitting this bead, but generally speaking I don't like the look of that. So I'll probably get back. I ain't got the grinder with me, to be fair, at the moment. Probably get back, scabble that off. But first, let's fit this bead. Now usually we'd be looking at this concrete lintel thinking, how are you going to get nails in there? What we've done on this job, we've just stuck it with a render. So, nice thick mix. And we've just stuck the whole lot with the render we've mixed up. KZP, sticky stuff. Just going to stick it all the way through. Put a nice little bulge back edge. Again, the pre-grit's acting nicely. Got something nice to key to. Get that on. Get our bead. Push that bad boy in there. Look at that. Sticky. Grips nicely. Push it in. That's it. All years used to worry about using fixings and nails. To be fair, this is all going to be rendered, so it's going to be tied into itself. But yeah, we've just been sticking it with the adhesive. white, the StarContact and KZP, and that's just working a treat. So I'll get my levels on that now, make sure it's all level, plumb to the wall. We should be good to go. So I like to run a thin layer of render all the way along the reveal, stick the bead onto it, and then always use a level to at least straighten off or plumb. If the wall's right out, don't plumb your walls against your windows. Make sure that the distance from the reveal is the same against the window line. I don't care what anyone says, it's got to look right rather than be plumb. But this wall was actually half decent, so we did plumb it up. Now look what we've got. We've got the beads. We've also got stop beads along that plinth line, just above the DPC. So that means we're not going to breach any damp. We're going to make sure we're going to keep it all watertight. Now again, I was talking about that paint. I just wanted to make sure, do you know what I mean? It was probably a precaution, but I'm going to make sure all that's taken back. We've got a nice background to work on there. Right, we've got an arch to put in here, haven't we, Charles? So we've put the scratch on, fold it round, trying to keep a nice surround all the way through. And then what we got, Charles?
We've got a nice arch bead here that we've now cut into place. So like that.
So we've actually put the beads out. We're going to make sure that sits in. Again, it's just going to follow the curvature there. It's called an arch bead disc, but because we've got a silicone top, we can fix it with the render and then render to it. Now that's where the real magic happens. Let's see your silicone gun, Charles.
What do you mean?
Let's see your silicone gun. Between the both of us, we haven't even got a silicone gun. This is how cool we are. But we've got a spindle.
So, a nice spindle. You have to make sure it's not a square one because it won't work.
Yeah.
Nice chamfered spindle. There you go.
This is hard pushing it in, pal.
So this is how I do my silicone in my bathroom.
Straightest line I've ever done, seen. Yeah, boy.
We were mainly fixing this on with render, it's just to give it an initial...
Yeah, we are going to render it in on a serious note. And then we're going to make sure I bring it to this point.
Hold that out a sec.
Yeah, oh, that's where you want it, pal.
We'll just have to build it out.
And then, once it's in place, we can run a rule from one end to another to make sure we're running parallel to the beads. But we just want to get that initial fix in there. Sit. Now he's got his end in. And then it should hold itself. There we go. Lovely curve. It's called an arch bead. Lovely. So this is the front of the gaff. Should look good, that, with a silicone top. Now ideally we would have stuck the beads on with some render. In that instance we just use silicone, but ideally to get your warranty from Baumit you'd want to stick it with the same product. But now what we're doing, let's talk about the job. We are applying the top coat of the base coat. Charles in his big boy vest top, showing off his guns. So we're working on top of the scratch again. We're going to do the same thing, exactly what we did before. We're just applying that level through. Charlie's put a tight coat, and then he likes to build it out after it. It's just the way Charlie does his thing. Everyone works differently. But again, we've applied that base coat onto that arch. Now this, with the bead, makes a tremendous difference. It gives you something to work to, and in my opinion, it's probably a lot easier than foaming. Again, we're just working that power float. We've used the water, sprayed that water onto it, and now you can see the beginnings of the arch. You can start to see this build taking shape. And I must admit, we were so chuffed how that arch came out. And like, if you are thinking how to do it, them arch beads are the one, because look how it's come out. Again, it takes a bit of hand floating around that curve there, but it really does make a hell of a difference. Now remember, this is just the base coat. You can see how nice that finish looks. We've not sponged it, this has just been floated. We do the inside of the doorway, by the way, we're not just leaving that. But we just wanted to show you how that curve came out. You know, with the arch beads, it makes a massive difference, a lot easier. Now what you want to do now is add a primer. Okay, so this is the primer, it's called Uniprimer. And it's an all universal primer. It can be used on StarContact, brickwork, but this is what you want to use before you apply the silicone top coat. Now ideally you want to wait a day per millimetre of thickness, So roughly 12 mil we applied. So from start to finish, you want to be waiting roughly 12 days. Which isn't bad when you're rendering a house. You've got a few days for it to do your bits and bobs anyway. So that's what you want from manufacturers. That's how long you'll be waiting before you apply this. Now here's the top coat. All the top coat, the SilikonTop it's called, it all comes in tubs. All you have to do is add a splash of water. Now, I like to add about 200 mils. You don't want any more than that really, but it's totally preference. What I'd do is, if you're new to using this stuff, just add a little bit of water to begin with, mix it up in the tubs, make sure all the aggregate is mixed together, and then see how you deal with it. Everyone's got a preference for Silicone Render It. Some people like it runny, some people like it thick. But what you do is you apply it, tie it onto the wall, and then you run it back on the trowel. You want to make sure you got a nice tight coat on, and you work it in sections. So what you'll see here is I'll stop there. I'm going to add a bit of fat or thickness to that edge, and that means that that won't dry out and it's got something to work to. But you always want that coat quite thin. I'm going to show you at the end of this video an opportunity to watch a full process on silicone rendering, so I'm just going to run through it just so I can show you the results. But once you've applied that thin layer, you then flow it up. This is a flat float, it's from Raffina, and it's a silicone rendering float, and all you do is, using small circular motions, you push that render into itself and it leaves you a nice lovely texture. Now you can have whatever colour you want with this product. You can bright pink, bright blue, bright yellow, totally up to you. Or you could just have white. It's totally up to you, but yeah, the colour is in the product basically. And as you can see here, this is the texture you get. It's quite a unique texture, I must admit. It's quite different to any sand cement or monocouche. But it's very easy to do, as long as you remember to work in sections and you don't get too far ahead of yourself. All you're doing when you're floating is you're just closing the pores and you're making sure that the texture compacts nicely to itself and there isn't no gaps. And when you're doing reveals, you just run the float vertically up it, and then you push the aggregate to the outer edge to make sure it's fully sealed up. Again, I'm going to show you an opportunity at the end of this video to watch a more in-depth video on how to do it. But here's a tricky bit with just following that curve. Again, sometimes it, can be a bit tricky, but like anything in the floating process, you just got to use your patience and make sure that all the prep was right, make sure your base coat is nice and tight, make sure that you put the primer on in all the areas. Basically, the prep, once the prep's done, then the finish is going to look for itself. Now look at that, you've got a nice tight arch, and this is the finished job. All of it's done, arch is complete, the inside next to the door's done, we've got nice solid angles running down to the ground, we've got stop beads running across the DPC line, so nice and watertight. And look at that. As a product, I think the silicone render is a great finish and very, very safe and crack-free from what I've seen. But yeah, it really is a nice product to use. So I definitely highly recommend it. And as you can see, there's that expansion joint in the middle running through like we were talking about. That runs halfway along the building, and that'll just stop any movement cracks. So that's it. A full guide on how to render a house with silicone render. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching. Hit subscribe, but more importantly, check this video on how we silicone rendered a timber frame house with cement boards, where we go in detail on how to use silicone render and exactly how it works. Click that video if you enjoyed this for a more in-depth scenario. Cheers.